The guy in the black hat with the gimp.
He's not as tough as he thinks.
Neither are we.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't mention it, Mom.
I was researching pickpockets, and I had a bunch of books on pickpockets and grifters in general, and all the books had chapters and information on confidence men. And the more I read about confidence men, I thought, God, this is an incredible subculture. Love to do a movie about this. I've never seen a movie about confidence men, at least not about this kind of confidence man. And since it was something that I'd never seen a movie about before, I just said, I got to do this.
She picked him clean. He never missed it.
God, it's like he's expecting a big night. Must be 15, 20 grand here.
And the thing that sort of attracted me about confidence men were they seemed to be, in some ways, almost moral outlaws because they didn't use violence. They didn't even steal. They used the mark's own greed against him. And in that way, they were sort of, even though they weren't consciously trying to do this, they were obviously trying to make money. But in some ways, they were exposing the hypocrisy and the greed of supposedly respectable people.
You just worry about your end, kid.
If we ever get to it.
The Sting came in a whole different package. It was a much smaller film with a whole cast of young people, young producers, young money people, very, very young, out of New York. Very ambitious, hadn't really done anything themselves. This was going to be a first shot. The writer, David Ward, was attached to it because it was his first, no, I think his second work. And they all had a kind of collective, and they wanted to support each other, which I totally respected. And they wanted him to direct it. And so when they sent it to me because we all kind of knew each other.
Visita mi canal.
And would I support him directing it and so forth? And I read it. And when I read it, I thought, okay, I don't know, I guess, maybe. You know, I tried hard to see myself in it, really. It seemed fun. It seemed different and kind of quirky. But because of its structure, I thought it would take a real master director to pull it off. And I didn't want to insult or not support a newcomer, but I said, I'm sorry, I think for me to be in this, it would have to be in the hands of a more experienced director. So if you want to do it with David, which I totally support, then why don't you go and see if you can put it together. So they had another cast in mind, they had other people involved. Next thing I knew, George called me, and he said, look, I just read this script. I think it's fabulous. And I said, you do? He said, yeah. And they told me why. He was obviously very taken with it. That's the first good sign when the director has a vision, that you're going to be very drawn to that.
When they did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, George Roy Hill rented a house from Paul in Beverly Hills. Now, when he came out to do The Sting, he called Newman on the phone and he said, is that house by any chance available at the moment for rent? And Newman said, yeah, as a matter of fact. What do you want to rent it? And Hill said, yeah. And Newman said, well, what do you do? What are you doing out here? George Roy Hill said, I'm making a picture with Redford. And Newman said, oh, anything in it for me? Now, George Roy Hill told me this story. There came a pause, and George Roy Hill saw the dollar signs turning in his head. And he answered, yes, there's a part. But I got to tell you now, it's the second part. And Newman said, send me a script.
George sent me a script. And I said, George, I think the script is wonderful. In fact, it's near perfect. But I am dead wrong for that part. And he said, why? I said, well, it seems very clear to me. This is the king handing the scepter to the prince.
Gondorf was a big man. Big, heavy-set guy with lots of weight.
I said, you should get someone who's long in the tooth and is gone, fading, and needs a replacement. That's what the whole point of the story is.
Glad to meet you, kid. You're a real horse's ass.
Luther said I could learn something from you. I already know how to drink.
This is my memory, and you can corroborate that with Redford. But Joanne and I were living in a tiny little apartment on East 50th Street, and they came up to talk to me about doing this.
Visita mi
We
casa.
lived on the 4th floor. They punched the button, and the elevator went past the 4th floor, up to some other floor. And during that time waiting for the elevator, the silence was absolutely deafening. And then George said, I think you're if you don't do this film. And I said, in that case, what can I say? And then the elevator came back down again, and I always keep thinking, what if the guy hadn't rung it on the 12th floor, and they'd come up the 4th floor, and nobody had insulted me like that?
Paul has no mind. He has a very poor mind. So I don't know what Paul remembered, but I suspect that sometime we were in an elevator, but I don't know that I can remember what happened in an elevator. I do know that George wanted him in the movie, so I really can't comment on it. I think maybe Paul and George might have been in an elevator. I don't remember an elevator, but then I'm losing my mind too. You know.
He had you down as a big timer. What happened?
I conned a senator from Florida on a stock deal. Little lobbyist thought he was going to take over General Electric. Some Shantuzi woke him, though, and he put the feds on me.
You mean you blew it?
Luther didn't tell me he had a big mouth.
You didn't tell me you was a screw-up either.
It was a terrific script because, first of all, it was extremely unique. It was touching a territory that had never even been close to being touched before. But you can't underestimate George. He's such a craftsman. He's had such experience with script. And because of his own life experience, coming from a publishing family, being interested in comic strips when he was a kid, he found great value in comic strips, the Sunday comics, because he believed that the 4-panel sequencing, where you had to tell a story in 4, at the most 5 panels, have a beginning, middle, end, and complete it, was a very powerful guide, and he kind of followed that. He told me that story once, which I thought was amazing.
I don't remember a more perfect script. Now, I know George had worked with David Ward on it for some time. I don't know to the extent that it had been changed, but I don't think we changed 4 words in that script the entire time we shot it.
It's a really just about a perfect piece of work in terms of screen craftsmanship.
You played any big cons since then?
Oh, I landed around a bunch of bull-hung towns. One kick ahead of the G-man. Would be still if Billy hadn't set me up here. Don't kid yourself, friend. I still know how.
When I write scripts, I tend to listen to music because it sort of keeps me in the mood of the piece. I mean, you write something over 2 or 3 months, you can sort of tend to lose that original feeling that made you want to write the script in the first place. And the music is always sort of a reminder to me of where I started. And when I was writing The Sting, I was listening to a lot of blues from the 30s and 40s. Bessie Smith, Big Bill Brunzi, Ida Cox. And so I sort of always felt that Hooker came from the world of blues.
Johnny Hooker! Ah! If you ain't a shopper in them linens!
Even Louis?
Black Chicago, sort of South Side Chicago, and that's why I made Luther black, who was sort of his surrogate father.
You're late. Where you been?
I had a couple of appointments, sir.
How much did you lose?
And that was the music I sort of saw for the movie.
Come on, Luther! Come on! Hustle!
I remember George giving me a call and saying, come on over to the house, when he had rented a place out in California where I was making a film. So I want to play something for you. And he had discovered Scott Joplin, which nobody had heard of. We'd heard of Ragtime, but I never heard of the name. And he was quite a good pianist, and he would play it. And he had it in his head that the rhythm of the film should follow that had to do with the character ability of the piece itself, and a period piece. It was just so much about George.
I think that probably George made the right choice in using the ragtime instead. I was actually opposed to it at first because I said it's the wrong time. Ragtime was much earlier. Ragtime was turn of the century, 1910. And George said, David, you may be one of 5 people who sees this movie that knows that. Nobody's going to care. I think it's right for the spirit of the movie, for the feeling of the movie. It expresses for me the kind of feeling I want the movie to have. And he was right.
I had discovered this language called Scott Joplin. I had all the pieces that you needed, and they just literally felt as if they'd been written for this picture. Particularly Ragtime worked for this picture because it's very tongue-in-cheek. And though I was criticized when the movie came out by some critics who said, how could you be using music that didn't really take place in the same era, you know, it wasn't in the same time, I would say yes, but the Ragtime by itself tells you it's fun, it's rhythmic, it's sassy, it's Chicago, you know. So this was one of probably the most joyful experience I ever had to work on a film. My kind of humor that I like and this film are very much akin, and therefore I could treat it with a little tongue-in-cheek. And I think that's what George liked. In fact, we had a running gag, which was that when we were going to record the film, I said to him, well, if you get there first, you can play the piano, and if I get there first, I'll play the piano. Because, you know, George Roy Hill could play the piano. And so for the first day, I got there about 45 minutes early, you know. It was interesting what piano I used, because I didn't want to use, quote, a honky-tonk piano at all. But I wanted to use a very sweet-sounding piano, and I used a Blüthner. So I didn't go for the dynamics, let's say, of a Bosendorfer or a Steinway. I went for a more quiet sound. I don't know that the normal person listening would hear the difference, but I think it did make a difference, because it had a little bit more grace to it. You could play the piano, and you knew you were never going to attack it. It was never going to sound attacked. It was always going to sound caressed. And that's one of the aspects of the Blüthner I really loved.
One of the things that makes the con itself believable is the creation of the entire world of the Confidence Man, which was a world that could only exist in the 30s and 40s because of the nature of police departments and the way cities ran in those days. But we wanted everything to be authentic, from the way things looked, from the way the Confidence Men talked, their slang, the way they organized the con, the way they ran a con. I researched all of that very carefully, and George was very concerned to keep that authenticity in the movie.
It was so authentic that it was just what I had remembered as a kid, being a Depression baby. I was born in 1923, so all through the 30s, I was that kind of kid. You know, nobody had any money. I mean, you put the newspapers in the soles of your shoes, and you know, you walked around like that because everybody had holes in their shoes, and you didn't think about it. And you invented games. You know, there were 2 or 3 things how to make stilts out of tin cans, and we invented those things. You know, the scooter with the one roller skate and a 2x4, and a box you picked up at the A&P.
There is a bit of Robin Hood quality in Confidence Men, although they didn't give the money to the poor. But they did certainly steal from the rich.
Make another bet tomorrow.
What the hell is this? Where's my money? I got 16 grand coming.
You owe me 15 grand already, besides. If your setup's as good as you said, there's plenty more to come.
I decide when to place the bets.
Not if you want me to keep making them for you.
Confidence Men were all from lower class backgrounds. They were usually not educated, but they were able to sort of mimic people who were educated and wealthy. It was one of their great strengths, is that they could pass themselves off as being cultured, as being educated, as running in the right circles.
Run those bums out of here.
Mr. Shaw, could I...
Don't give me any of your lip, kid. I'll run them out of here.
They sort of delighted in doing that. They sort of delighted in putting that on, because that's not at all who they were.
The great Henry Gondorff. You got any more? Better give it all to me if you want to keep it.
They think I've been holding out on them. My wife got sick and I had to pay the bill. I wasn't holding out on them.
Stuff it down
I always
your
been
pants
good
here.
for the money before,
Like
but
that.
this
Got
time
it?
they gave me a deadline.
Yeah. And he's not hurting anybody. He's taken from other crooks, you know?
Thanks.
Yeah.
The first guy he takes it from, that guy said, was the easiest money I ever made. Drive me to the railroad station.
I just made the world's easiest 5 grand.
And then he realized he's been had. So they wind up with a hole in his eye.
It was a picture that had a great deal of camaraderie in it and ensemble playing. And George Roy Hill had a great deal to do with that. The way he did those 2 weeks of rehearsal, you knew that you were in a piece with a lot of people. They were as important or even more important than you. So forget you and join.
JJ, you think I can get that poker game?
All you gotta do is show up with a lot of money and look like a sucker.
I also gotta win. Oh, by the way, have you guys been passing bad money lately?
One of the things George had as a filmmaker was that he understood the value of surprises. He would throw a surprise at the audience. Just when the audience thought they had something figured out, he'd go right or left when they were going right. He'd throw a wrench into it. By the time they got back on board, you thought you were back on again, he'd take another until you got to the end. So George had this wonderful kind of, that was part of his perversity. Just when you thought you were in safe territory, he jumped to another track and you wondered what was going on. And I think that's what kept the movie alive.
The shots in The Sting, I can remember them discussing them.
Excuse me. I'm looking for a guy named Henry Gondorf. Know him?
No. The boys, I'll call them, had their input. They had a freedom with him. And Redford, and that particular moment, I don't know whatever it was that he liked, but he said the image of her coming down in that outfit against those steps, he said, just look at it. I remember him saying to George, just look at it. You know, it was between them, but I do know that Redford slowed it down. And Redford saying, just, there's an image there that's just, he's a painter, Redford. And he just saw an image that he just said, let's just hold on that. They had that with each other, with that freedom, that allowance to make a suggestion.
Mr. Shaw, we usually require a tie at this table. If you don't have one, we can get you one. Hey, that'd be real nice of you, Mr. Loneman.
It was just a great sense of allowability, anything goes. Show me. But experimentation and a free rein to make mistakes and show your rear end, and it was a great set to work out.
You're gonna stay for breakfast, and you already know how to eat.
I just remember when we were rehearsing, he said, "Why are you walking out of the scene?" I said, "I'm